Don't you ever touch her again! The little girl screamed, her tiny fists still clenched, her whole body shaking as she stood between her mother and the woman in white. Nobody in that room moved, nobody breathed. A 3-year-old had just thrown herself at a woman worth more than the mansion they were standing in, and for one long, frozen second, everyone waited to see what would happen next. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. I need you to hear this one. A tiny girl, barely 3 years old, standing in a marble foyer the size of a football field, staring up at a woman twice her height, a woman dressed in a silk gown that cost more than her mother earned in a year. The little girl wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to see what she saw. But she did, and in the next 10 seconds, she did something that no one in that house would ever forget. Something that would end an engagement, expose a lie that had been buried for months, and change the course of 3 lives forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story is not what you think it is, and the twist near the end will completely change how you see everything that happened before it. Before we continue, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this little story travels. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories like this every single week. Stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things when nobody is watching. Okay? Let's get into it. Her name was Elena Vance, and for 3 years, she had worked as a housekeeper in the Ashford estate on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. A sprawling, white-columned mansion set behind a wall of ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. She had come to that house with nothing but a suitcase, a 2-month-old baby girl named Ruby, and a letter of recommendation from a family she used to work for in Charleston. She had been hired by Nathaniel Ashford himself, a 36-year-old shipping magnate who had built his fortune from a single cargo route between Savannah and Rotterdam into an empire that now touched 4 continents. Nathaniel wasn't like the other wealthy men Elena had worked for in the past. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look through people like they were furniture. He remembered the names of everyone on his staff, and every year on Ruby's birthday, he left a small gift outside Elena's door. Nothing extravagant, just a book, or a stuffed animal, or once, a tiny pair of rain boots, because Ruby loved jumping in puddles. Ruby had grown up practically inside those walls. She knew every hallway, every secret nook behind the library shelves, every squeaky floorboard on the second staircase. The staff adored her. The gardener, a quiet man named Otis, who had worked the grounds for over 20 years, called her Little Boss, because she used to follow him around the rose garden, asking 100 questions a minute. The chef, a Frenchwoman named Colette, kept a small stool by the kitchen island just for Ruby, so she could watch pastries being made without getting underfoot. And Nathaniel would come home some evenings, exhausted from 12-hour negotiations in Singapore or London, and the first thing he'd do was find Ruby, scoop her onto his shoulders, and walk the length of the East Wing pretending to be a giant while she shrieked with laughter. Elena used to worry sometimes that she was overstepping, that a housekeeper's daughter shouldn't be so close to the man who owned the house. But Nathaniel never once made her feel that way. "This house has been too quiet for too long," he told her once, watching Ruby chase fireflies across the back lawn as the sun went down. "She's the first thing that's made it feel alive in years." Everything changed the spring Ruby turned 3, when Nathaniel came home from a business trip to Miami and announced almost shyly that he had met someone. Her name was Camille Duval, a former event planner turned lifestyle consultant who had organized a charity gala Nathaniel had attended. Within 6 weeks, Camille had moved into the Ashford estate. Within 4 months, there was a ring on her finger, a flawless 8-carat emerald-cut diamond that Elena had to polish smudges off of twice a day because Camille refused to take it off, even in the shower. At first, Camille was pleasant enough in the way that people are pleasant when they think someone is watching. She smiled at the staff during dinner parties. She complimented Colette's soufflés in front of guests. But Elena noticed things. Small things. The kind of things only someone who cleans a house for a living ever notices. The way Camille's smile disappeared the instant Nathaniel left the room. The way she'd snap her fingers at Otis instead of saying his name. The way she looked at Ruby. Not with warmth, not even with indifference, but with something colder, something that made Elena's stomach twist every time she caught it. "She looks at my daughter like she's an insect that wandered into her house," Elena confided one evening to Colette, as they folded linens in the laundry room long after the family had gone to bed. "She looks at everyone that way, chérie," Colette said, not looking up from the tablecloth in her hands. "Except him. Watch how her whole face changes when he walks in. It's a performance. I've cooked for enough of these women to know a performance when I see one." Elena wanted to believe Colette was exaggerating. She wanted to believe that Nathaniel, a man sharp enough to build a global shipping empire from nothing, would never be fooled by someone putting on an act. But 3 weeks before the wedding, on a warm Thursday evening in early June, Elena got proof that Colette had been right all along, and it came from the last person she ever expected, her own daughter. It happened during the final walkthrough for the engagement gala, a lavish pre-wedding celebration that Camille had spent nearly $200,000 planning. The ballroom on the estate's west wing had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, crystal chandeliers lowered and polished until they threw rainbows across the marble floor, a live orchestra rehearsing in the corner, white orchids flown in from Ecuador arranged in towering columns along every wall. Elena had been asked to help the event staff with final preparations, which meant Ruby, who had nowhere else to be that evening, sat quietly on a folding chair near the kitchen entrance, swinging her little legs and coloring in a book Colette had given her. Nathaniel was supposed to be there too, but a call from his Rotterdam office had pulled him into his study at the last minute, and he'd promised to join them in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes were all it took. Elena had stepped away to help carry a tray of centerpieces, leaving Ruby just outside the ballroom doors, close enough to see but far enough to be forgotten. And Camille, standing near the orchestra with her wedding planner, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane, thought no one important was listening when she pulled out her phone and made a call. "No, everything is fine. It's under control," Camille said into the phone, her voice dropping into a register Elena had never heard her use before. Flat, businesslike, nothing like the honeyed tone she used around Nathaniel. "The wedding happens in 3 weeks. Once the prenup is signed and the accounts are merged, you'll have your money within the month. I told you, stop calling me at this number." Ruby, coloring quietly 6 feet away with a purple crayon in her small fist, didn't understand most of what she was hearing. She was 3 years old. She didn't know what a prenup was, didn't know what merged accounts meant, didn't understand that the woman across the room was talking about her father like he was a bank vault waiting to be cracked open. But children remember things adults don't expect them to remember. They remember tones of voice. They remember the way a person's face changes when they think no one is looking. And Ruby, without fully understanding why, felt something cold settle in her small chest as she watched Camille laugh. A hard, ugly laugh, nothing like the soft giggle she used at dinner, before ending the call and sliding the phone back into her clutch. What Ruby didn't know was that Diane, the wedding planner standing 3 feet away, had heard every word, too. And Diane, unlike a 3-year-old with a crayon, understood exactly what she'd just witnessed. Diane didn't say anything that night. She was a professional, and professionals in her line of work learned early on not to involve themselves in the private affairs of clients who paid enormous sums of money and could make a single phone call to ruin a small business overnight. But she did something quieter, something almost automatic. She glanced toward the ballroom entrance, toward the little girl on the folding chair, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Ruby stared back at her with an expression far too serious for a 3-year-old, and Diane felt an unexpected chill crawl up the back of her neck. 10 minutes later, everything came apart in a way none of them could have predicted. Camille, walking back toward the ballroom with her wedding planner trailing behind, spotted Ruby sitting on the folding chair, crayons scattered across her lap, a smear of purple wax on her palm where she'd pressed too hard on the paper. And something about the sight of the little girl, sitting there, watching, existing in a space Camille had decided belonged only to important people, seemed to set something off in her. What is she still doing here? Camille snapped at no one in particular, loud enough that the orchestra musicians looked up from their sheet music. This is a $200,000 event, not a daycare. Someone needs to get her out of my sightline before the photographer arrives. Ruby looked up, confused, clutching her coloring book against her chest. She didn't move fast enough. Camille crossed the distance between them in 4 sharp strides, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots, and reached down to grab Ruby by the arm. Not gently, not the way you'd guide a lost child back to her mother, but hard, hard enough that Ruby's coloring book slipped from her lap and hit the floor, crayons scattering across the marble in every direction. "Get up!" Camille hissed, her fingers digging into the soft skin of Ruby's upper arm. "You do not belong in this room." And that was the exact moment Elena walked back through the kitchen doors, carrying an armful of white orchids, just in time to see the woman her boss was about to marry gripping her daughter's arm hard enough to leave 4 small crescent-shaped marks on her skin, and just in time to hear her daughter's voice, small but absolutely unshaking, cut through the entire ballroom like a blade. "Don't you ever touch her again!" But it wasn't Ruby who screamed those words. It was Ruby who moved first, small, fast, and utterly fearless, twisting free of Camille's grip and shoving both tiny hands against the older woman's leg with every ounce of strength a 3-year-old body could produce. Camille stumbled backward, more from shock than from any real force, her heel catching against the leg of a nearby chair, and for one impossible second, the future Mrs. Ashford lost her balance in front of an entire ballroom staff, an orchestra, a wedding planner, and the housekeeper whose daughter had just attacked her. The room went completely silent. And that is exactly the moment Nathaniel Ashford walked through the ballroom doors. 20 minutes late, his phone still in his hand, just in time to see his fiancée stumbling backward, his housekeeper's daughter standing between them with her chest heaving and her small fists still raised, and the beginning of a truth that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the woman he was 3 weeks away from marrying. He froze in the doorway, his eyes moving from Camille's furious face to the 4 faint red marks already blooming on Ruby's small arm, to Diane, the wedding planner, who was staring at the floor like she desperately wished she could disappear into it. "What?" Nathaniel said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is going on in here?" For a moment nobody answered him. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely now, the musicians frozen mid-note, bows hovering just above their strings. A caterer near the back wall had gone still with a tray of champagne flutes balanced on one palm. Even the air conditioning seemed to hum louder in the silence, as if the whole house itself was holding its breath along with everyone inside it. Camille recovered first. She always did. She smoothed the front of her dress, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and turned toward Nathaniel with an expression so instantly soft, so perfectly wounded, that for a split second, even Elena almost doubted what she had just seen with her own eyes. "Nathaniel, thank God you're here," Camille breathed, crossing the marble floor toward him, her voice trembling in a way that sounded almost convincing. "That child just attacked me. Out of nowhere. I was simply trying to move her out of the photographer's path, and she shoved me, hard enough that I nearly fell. I think I need to sit down." Nathaniel didn't move toward her. His eyes were still on Ruby, still on the 4 small red marks rising on her upper arm, still on the coloring book lying open on the floor with a purple crayon rolled halfway across the marble. "Ruby," he said quietly, crouching down so he was at her eye level, his voice completely different now, gentle in a way it hadn't been a second ago. "Sweetheart, did she grab your arm?" Ruby's chin trembled. She looked up at her mother first, the way children do when they're not sure if they're in trouble, and Elena, still frozen near the kitchen doors with an armful of orchids she'd forgotten she was holding, nodded at her daughter, silently telling her it was okay to speak. "She grabbed me hard," Ruby said, her small voice wobbling but clear enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "It hurt. I told her to stop and she didn't stop. So I pushed her leg. That's not what happened. Camille cut in quickly, too quickly, her voice climbing half an octave. Nathaniel, you cannot possibly believe a 3-year-old over me. She's a child. Children exaggerate. Children lie. I don't lie, Ruby said, and something about the flat, wounded certainty in her voice made even Diane, the wedding planner, look up from the floor. Nathaniel stood slowly, and when he turned to face Camille, something in his expression had shifted. Not anger yet, not quite, but the beginning of a question he had clearly never let himself ask out loud before. There are 4 marks on her arm, Camille, he said. 4 fingers. I know what a grip like that looks like. She was in the way of a $200,000 photography setup, Camille said. And there it was. The crack Elena had been waiting 3 years to see, the moment the honeyed voice finally slipped and something colder came through underneath it. I don't have time to babysit the housekeeper's daughter every time she wanders into a room she doesn't belong in. The words landed in the ballroom like a dropped glass. Colette, who had come out from the kitchen to see what the commotion was about, actually put a hand over her mouth. Otis, standing near the terrace doors with a crate of white orchids, set the crate down slowly, as if he didn't trust his own hands anymore. Elena felt something break loose in her chest. Not rage exactly, but 3 years of small, swallowed humiliations finally rising to the surface all at once. She set the orchids down on the nearest table and walked forward, placing herself gently but firmly between her daughter and Camille. She is not in anyone's way, Elena said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. She has grown up in this house. She has more right to stand in that doorway than the flowers you flew in from Ecuador. Excuse me? Camille's eyes flashed. You work for this family. You do not speak to me that way. I work for Nathaniel, Elena said quietly. Not for you. Not yet, anyway. The word yet hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, and Nathaniel's eyes moved between the 2 women, something clicking into place behind them that had clearly been trying to click into place for months. It was Diane, the wedding planner, who finally broke the silence in the worst possible way, or the best, depending on how you looked at it. Mr. Ashford? Diane said carefully, stepping forward with the caution of someone about to detonate something she couldn't take back. I need to tell you something, and I probably should have told you weeks ago. I didn't think it was my place, but given what just happened, I don't think I can stay quiet anymore. Camille's head snapped toward her wedding planner so fast that her earring nearly caught on her collar. Diane, don't, she said, and for the first time all evening, there was real fear in her voice instead of performance. 20 minutes ago, Diane continued, ignoring her, I was standing right over there, going over the orchestra's set list with Miss Duval, when she took a phone call. I wasn't trying to listen. I couldn't help it. She wasn't exactly quiet. She told whoever was on the other end of that call that the wedding happens in 3 weeks, that once the prenup is signed and the accounts are merged, they'd have their money within the month. Her exact words, Mr. Ashford. I remember them because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The ballroom, already silent, seemed to somehow go even quieter. Nathaniel didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at Camille, and Elena watched something in his face close like a door. Not slam shut, not dramatic, just quietly, permanently close. The way a man's face changes when he finally allows himself to see something he'd spent months refusing to look at directly. Who were you talking to, Camille? He asked, and his voice was so calm it was almost worse than shouting would have been. It's not what it sounds like, Camille said quickly, her composure finally, completely cracking, her hands twisting together in front of her. Diane misunderstood. She heard one side of a conversation out of context. Who? Nathaniel repeated. Were you talking to? Camille's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. And in that pause, in that terrible, telling silence, 3-year-old Ruby, still standing pressed against her mother's side, still rubbing the red marks on her small arm, said something that none of the adults in that room expected, something she had clearly been turning over in her mind since the moment she'd overheard it near the orchestra chairs 20 minutes earlier. She said, "Once the prenup is signed," Ruby said quietly, her small voice cutting through the tension like it belonged there. "I heard her say it. She was laughing on the phone. She doesn't laugh like that with you, Daddy." It wasn't a legal testimony. It wasn't proof of anything a court would accept. But it was the truth, spoken plainly by a child who had no reason to lie and no understanding of the damage her words would do. And somehow, that made it land harder than anything Diane had said. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, he looked at Camille the way a man looks at a stranger who has been wearing his fiancée's face for the last 4 months. "Get your things," he said quietly. "You have until tomorrow morning." "Nathaniel, please, you're letting a housekeeper's daughter and an overly dramatic wedding planner destroy something real between us." "I built a shipping company from a single cargo route," Nathaniel said, cutting her off, his voice still eerily calm. "I know what it sounds like when someone is talking about merging accounts like they're closing a deal, Camille. I've made that exact call myself 100 times. You just made the mistake of thinking I'd never recognize my own voice coming out of yours." Camille stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for some crack, some hesitation she could work her way back into. She found none. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the ballroom, her 4-inch heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded, for the first time all evening, less like confidence and more like retreat. The silence that followed her departure lasted almost a full minute before Colette finally exhaled and said quietly, to no one in particular, "I told you it was a performance." Nathaniel didn't laugh, not yet. He turned instead toward Elena and Ruby, crouching down again in front of the little girl who had, in the space of about 90 seconds, unraveled a lie 4 months in the making. "Ruby," he said gently, "I'm sorry she grabbed you. I'm sorry I wasn't here fast enough. That should never have happened to you. Not in this house, not anywhere." Ruby, exhausted from the whole ordeal, simply leaned forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck, the way she had 100 times before over the years, and this time Nathaniel held on a little longer than usual, his eyes closed, his jaw tight. Over Ruby's shoulder, he looked at Elena. "I owe you an apology too," he said quietly. "You tried to tell me things weren't right months ago, in small ways, and I didn't listen closely enough. I let myself get talked into believing what was easy instead of what was true." "You're not the first person she fooled," Elena said softly. "Diane wasn't the only one who noticed. We all did. We just didn't think it was our place to say anything." "It should have been my place to ask," Nathaniel said. "That's on me, not on any of you." The engagement gala, of course, never happened. The orchids were donated to a hospital across town the next morning. The orchestra was paid in full and sent home with a bottle of wine each for their trouble. And Camille Duval left the Ashford estate before sunrise, her 8-carat ring left behind on the nightstand of the guest room she'd been quietly moved into the night before. A small, quiet detail that Elena noticed when she went in to change the sheets 3 days later, and never mentioned to anyone. It took months for the house to feel normal again, in the strange, slow way that houses do after something breaks and starts to heal. Nathaniel spent more evenings at home. He stopped scheduling calls during dinner. He started, almost shyly at first, asking Elena to join him and Ruby for a movie some Friday nights, instead of retreating to his study after Ruby went to bed. Small, careful gestures from a man who had learned, the hard way, what it looked like when someone's kindness was real instead of performed. It was almost a year later, on a warm evening in early June, nearly to the day of the gala that never happened, that Nathaniel found Elena in the garden, watching Ruby chase fireflies across the lawn with Otis trailing patiently behind her, the same way he had 100 times before. "I keep thinking about that night," Nathaniel said quietly, watching his daughter, because that's what Ruby had become to him in every way that mattered, long before any paperwork would ever make it official. Laugh and stumble through the grass. About how it took a 3-year-old shoving her tiny hands against someone twice her size to make me finally see what everyone else in this house had known for months. She wasn't trying to expose anyone, Elena said, smiling as she watched her daughter. She just didn't like watching someone hurt her mother's friend. That's all it ever was to her. Maybe that's exactly why it worked, Nathaniel said. Because it wasn't calculated. It was just true. He reached down and took Elena's hand, not as an employer, not as an apology, but simply because it felt like the most natural thing in the world after everything they'd survived together. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the Ashford estate didn't feel like a house full of too many empty rooms. It felt, finally, like it belonged to the people actually living in it. If this story moved you even a little, go ahead and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know, and it takes just 1 second of your time. If you're new here and you enjoyed today's story, hit that subscribe button right now.